Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm exploring AI, but don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those usual conversations, because this one has a distinctly human flavour. In a world increasingly shaped by AI, what happens to trust, to empathy, to ethics? We often think of automation as a neutral upgrade. It's faster, more efficient and less error-prone. But what if the way we implement it, and AI in particular, changes the very people it's meant to serve? My guest, Richard Chataway, has been on the show before. There's a link to that in the show notes. He's a behavioural science expert who's been asking precisely these questions. And on this episode, we explore how humans interact with technology, and AI in particular, and how those interactions can trigger behaviours that might seem both surprising and somewhat unsettling. Why, for example, do people lie more to bots than to humans? What happens to employee well-being in places like call centres when AI can handle the simple stuff, leaving humans to manage the emotionally draining tasks? And how do seemingly small design choices in customer journeys make fraud feel like fairness? Richard and I unpack the real-world consequences of ignoring psychology in digital transformation. We look at biased data, moral licensing, algorithmic trust, and why even empathy can backfire if it's faked. This isn't a negative take on technology. It's about recognising that every system we design will shape human behaviour. The question is, are we ready for what we're shaping? Richard is a fascinating guest, and I think you're going to find this really interesting. It's my discussion with Richard Chataway on designing AI for humans. Richard, welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's such a pleasure to have you back. And look, you and I caught up recently in Munich 5 or 6 years. Who knows? Since we last spoke on the show, we talked last time about your book, The Behaviour Business. And the conversation that we had, you had some really fascinating things to share with us. So why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about what you've been doing since the last time we spoke?
Great. Yeah. No, and thanks very much for inviting me back on. Yeah. So I guess when we caught up 5 years ago, I think was when my book, The Behavior Business, came out, which I'd written over the preceding kind of 18 months, 2 years, and which included some content around AI and implications for AI, and as they were in 2020. And I guess in the 5 years since then, not only is the technology and the use cases and how people are using and interacting with AI has moved on significantly, but also I guess in terms of my own role and the work I've been doing has changed quite a lot. So I've since then, when I was working for a company called BVA Consulting, running their UK business, I've moved on to a role now working for a company called Concentrix, who are a global technology and transformation company working with around 2,000 brands globally in over 70 different countries. And I head up our behavior change team here. So what we do is we work with clients all around the world in helping them apply behavioral science to deliver better experiences, primarily for customers. And so what that means is that we're grappling with a lot of challenges around technology and transformation, and particularly those related to AI. But also, we've been successfully applying behavioral science to help them with those challenges and to help them deliver better experiences for their employees and their customers. So in the last 5 years, I've got a lot more experience in terms of addressing those challenges, and particularly seen a lot of the challenges and opportunities that AI has presented in those kind of worlds.
Talk to us a little bit about AI and behavioural science, because in the behavioural science field, everybody's sort of talking about how these two things fit together. But that might not be obvious to everybody. So can you just unpick a little bit about what's the sort of, AI is relevant to everything, but what's the nexus with behavioural science?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, I guess, because so you might recall from in my book, the sort of opening line of my book was, if you're in business, you're in the business of behaviour. And what I meant by that is that every business challenge, as you know well, in the worlds in which you operate in terms of human risk and compliance, every challenge has a behavioural component to it. We want people who currently do X to do Y, or to stop doing X, or to do less of X. And so what that means is an understanding of human behaviour, the understanding of how people make decisions in the real world, which is really what sits at the heart of behavioural science, what the frameworks that it gives us for understanding human behaviour. There's value they can add in terms of those business challenges. And obviously, as I say, over the last 5 years, one of the core business challenges, one of the most critical challenges that businesses have been facing, is about how to make use of and integrate AI-based technologies into their businesses so they deliver efficiencies, but also help them solve the challenges and solve the problems that they face in terms of in the world in which I operate around customer experiences and deliver better customer experiences. So, that intersection between AI and behavioral science, I guess, is on the one hand, because that is a major business problem. And my view, and I think your view as well, is that behavioral science has value to add with most of the challenges that businesses face. And this has become a much more high profile and prevalent challenge for businesses. But also, I think more fundamentally, any technology that we use, whether it's AI based or not in a business, is serving the purposes of humans. Humans are still the beneficiaries of the services and products that businesses provide, for the time being, at least. As long as until the robots or the aliens take over, they're still in the service of humans, and shareholders remain humans, your employees remain humans, and your customers remain humans. So an understanding of the inherent biases and heuristics, mental rules of thumb that we use to make decisions as humans, which is what behavioral science tells us all about, has value to add. And I think, one of the things that I wrote about, which I guess in the behavior business, which is kind of, we now got a much stronger set of principles and an evidence base for, is that the interactions that we have with AI-based technologies or anything that's fueled by algorithms, there's intrinsic differences to those between a human to human interaction. So to give you an example, this conversation that you and I are having today, there's a set of non-conscious biases that are governing this interaction between us, which we may not, which we're unaware of because they're not conscious. If the same content and the same conversation that we're having were being delivered by an avatar of me or a bot, you would respond to it differently, and your listeners would respond to it differently, simply because it was coming from an avatar or a bot, because there's a whole different set of biases that govern that interaction. So, if you think about it in the world of customer experience, that presents a really interesting problem, which is, we want to make use of these tools to deliver better experiences for our customers who are humans, but we can't just simply take the same content, the same scripting, the same guidance and apply it in that context, because people will respond to it differently, and there's a different set of biases that govern that interaction. So that's one example, I guess, of kind of some of the challenges that we face in this area.
And I think this is super interesting, right? Because when we look at it, in essence, this is humans deploying a technology that we don't fully understand, that sort of has human attributes and deliberately has human attributes, right? It's been set up in that way, particularly with Gen AI, for example. And what I think is interesting there is, to your point, is as we roll it out, it's what do we use it for? How do we interact with it? What data do we put into it? What authority do we give it? How do we allow it to feed stuff back to us? And where do the limits of that lie? And so I think this is a really interesting question. This isn't just sort of rolling out something standard. We need to be quite careful with this, and we need to understand where we might get this wrong. And I think we've, to your point, we've seen lots of use cases that are inappropriate, where it's the technology's been asked to make decisions that shouldn't happen, and some of that is predictable, and some of that we're finding out as we go.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on a really important point there, which is that all data that humans touch contains traces of bias. So when we create tools using data that, based on human behavior, or that tell us something about human behavior, there will be the biases inherent within that will become magnified. So, there's been in my book, I talked about some high profile examples that had sort of happened in the 2010s around, for example, when Amazon introduced a AI-based screening tool for CVs for applicants for jobs at Amazon. As a way of speeding up their recruitment process. What they found within very quickly was the tool started screening out all CVs from women. So any women who applied for roles were instantly being screened out of the process. And that wasn't because they designed that AI to exclude women. It was because historically they had a bias against recruiting women. And all that the algorithm had done was, because it was learning from that data, was it was doing it more effectively, and it was doing it more efficiently, and it magnified the bias that was in that process that they had. And obviously that's a very negative outcome, and something that became very clear to them very quickly, and they had to switch off the AI because of it. But, you can see the challenge. Some of the other examples that I've talked about in the past is, there's data that suggests that self-driving cars are effectively racist because they've been trained on data predominantly based on the streets of Northern California, where there's a majority white population, And so they are not as good at recognizing non-white pedestrians, for example, as they are white pedestrians. And what that means is that your self-driving cars are more likely to run you over if you're not white. Now, these are very, very negative and, very dangerous outcomes from these tools, simply because the data that's being used to train them is not being representative, and there hasn't been sufficient understanding of the biases inherent in that data. So, to your point, there's lots of use cases around that and examples of how that could, it can lead to negative outcomes. What's interesting as well, I think, that we now have a greater awareness of, and what's perhaps moved on in the last 5 years, is in addition to that, we also have an understanding, as I say, of the different nature of a human to AI interaction versus human to human interaction triggers a different set of biases in the humans who are using that technology. So one really interesting study that was done recently was about, in a customer experience context, whether we're more likely to be dishonest or deceitful or potentially fraudulent if we're dealing with an AI tool or not. So in this study, they created two scenarios. One was where effectively the scenario was you were told you were either interacting with a human or with a bot, an AI-based bot. And what happened was that human or AI bot had pre-selected a number between 1 and 10. And you had no other information than that, and you had to guess what number had been selected. Then you were told the number, and you had to report how accurate your guess was. So it was a secret guess that you made. And what that meant was there was the opportunity to lie about how accurate your prediction had been. And what they found was that the answer was always 8. So whether it was a human or a bot, they'd always selected the number 8. And statistically, because there was no other information to go on, you would expect the average guess to be about 5, somewhere in the middle, because it was totally random. But actually what they found was that when people thought they were guessing against the human, on average, they said their guess was 6. And when they were guessing what a bot had selected, their average guess was 6.9. So people lied a little bit in both scenarios, but they lied more when they thought they were guessing against a bot. But of course, there's no kind of consequences to that other than, just a sense of potential self-awareness of being dishonest in that scenario. When you put some financial gain into the scenario, the figures changed quite dramatically. So they created a scenario where, similar again, you are either interacting with a human agent or you're interacting with an AI-based agent, AI bot. And the scenario was that you'd bought some clothing items online and you wanted to return them. But the only way to get back your delivery fee, which was relatively small value, sort of $5, $10, the only way to get back your delivery fee was to lie about your reasons for returning it. That was, in effect, you had to say items were faulty rather than you just didn't like them. And in the scenario of people interacting with a human agent, 12% of people lied to get back that shipping fee. When they were interacting with a bot, 62% of people lied. So basically 62% of people behaved in a fraudulent way to get back that money. And that's really interesting for lots of reasons. One, it shows that potentially replacing a human customer service representative, for example, in this example, with a bot could expose you to a lot more risk in terms of fraudulent behavior from customers. The second thing is that people were, more willing to be fraudulent when they're dealing with a bot. And what that suggests is that the usual biases that govern our behavior about, our perception of ourselves and our perception of being honest and being, and not behaving in fraudulent ways, those biases are not triggered as effectively when people think they're interacting with a bot. And so, how we design those experiences and the way we design those experiences becomes really critical. To your point earlier, do we make them feel more human? Do we try and trigger some of those biases by making people think that they're interacting with a human, or at least, creating it a more human-like, a more warm and social experience for people so that they're less likely to behave in this way? But it's, it's to your point, it's really interesting in terms of now we're seeing more and more use of these tools. We're also gaining more data and gaining more understanding of these scenarios where these risks exist. And, I read, I think it was yesterday, that Amazon Fresh have just announced they're closing all of their stores in the UK, which, if you're familiar with those Amazon Fresh stores, they are the ones where you have to use an app to enter. There's no human interaction in there. You simply, you scan your items, you walk out the store without interacting with the human at the checkout. And, whatever the reasons for them closing those stores, what's become evident is that, with things like self-service checkouts, it significantly increased the risk of theft and shoplifting, which is obviously, a significant cost for those businesses. But also, I think as people, we don't find those experiences as enjoyable as we do when we have that element of human interaction with someone, and we see the human faces at the checkout as we're in the store. So, I should caveat all of this by saying, and this is a really critical point about how we apply this understanding at Concentrix, I don't believe that we're not benefiting from these technologies, and they don't have great opportunities and applications within the customer experience world. And we've got, plenty of great use cases around that. But what I am saying is that we need to have that understanding of human behavior to inform when it works, when it's appropriate, and when it isn't.
And I find all this fascinating because as you were talking, I was thinking about, businesses have been very quick. When they think it's in their interest, they roll this stuff out. So I was doing a talk with the military recently, and I was joking about, I said, let's talk about the world's fastest deployment. And it's not done by you. It was done by McDonald's, right? It's those touch screens. So they roll those out. And we know that they're not doing that because people order less food. We know because one of the reasons might be, he said, projecting hugely on his own experience, I can go and order 2 Big Mac meals for myself without having to embarrass myself in front of a human being, right? Will be one of the reasons why. And so they use these things in that advantage. And I was fascinated as you were talking because I thought, well, on the one hand, I get that shoplifting, however you do it, is bad. Actually, if you look at the returns process that you talked about there, then yes, if I'm constantly re-engaging with the chatbot to try and get my postage refunded or not get charged for it, you could say, well, that's unethical, right? You should be honest up front. But then you sort of go, well, in a way, they're creating an environment that incentivizes me to do that. Because I sort of sit there and say, well, is it ethical for them to return the postage under one circumstance, not another? And it might be, given the example you gave me. But I would also contend that in many cases, you're setting up an environment that facilitates, in some cases, that sort of negotiation. I can't go back to a human being and have the same sort of tell a different story. I can't press the back button and tell a different story. And therefore, because they've set that up, in a way, you might argue, and as I say, this is not condoning shoplifting or dishonesty, but you might argue that they have created an environment that drives that sort of behavior. And so what I think is fascinating is, as you look at how do we actually interact with these machines, is that in the same way that the choice architecture that we might present in other forms influences our behavior, the use of technology has a natural consequence that we will engage with it differently. And so there's a little bit of me that goes, and again, accepting the extreme things, is sort of, well, you reap what you sow. You've kind of encouraged that behavior. And as we get smarter about these things, it seems to me that actually businesses shouldn't just view tech as a one-way thing, saying it's all going to be positive. They need to recognize what they're unleashing. This is sort of, they've almost brought that upon themselves. So I don't necessarily blame the humans that are trying to, yes to the shoplifting, that's not acceptable, but the gaming the system to get what you want, in a way, that's sort of encouraging it.
Yeah, I guess, if I'm understanding correctly, I think what you're saying is the implicit association that we're building with customers when we are transforming a human experience into one that's delivered through technology is that, I'm not saying that this is true in every case, but in some cases the implication is that we are not as caring about, or we don't care about your business as much. Is that effectively what you're saying, I think? And that therefore, that primes, for want of a better word, some of those dishonest behaviors amongst customers. Is that?
I think what I'm sort of saying is that these techniques, it's always viewed as, we'll roll this stuff out and it will only be good for us.
Yes.
And actually what we're seeing, I don't blame businesses for trying this stuff out, right? Because the only way you find out what happens is by rolling this stuff out. But we've now reached a point with the data that you're highlighting, both the research, but also we can see the reality with the decisions that businesses are making, even if we don't fully understand the basis of it, that points towards, well, it's not just an unalloyed good. In other words, it doesn't always work in favor of the business.
Yes.
And so
yes.
I guess where I'm coming at this thing from, if I sort of looked at it from an ethical perspective, you could say, oh, this has allowed bad people to do bad things, right? And recognizing fully that bad things aren't just done by bad people; they can be done by good people as well. But as we look at it, you can sort of say, well, I think it's incumbent on people as they make those decisions to roll things out to recognize that, and not just pin it everything on, oh, look at these awful consumers trying it on with us, but to recognize that actually you're unleashing a set of dynamics in the same way that you're unleashing a set of dynamics by where you put stuff in the store or how you present things or how you price things.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what we, what I talk about and what we as a business at Concentrix have been talking about is that, we shouldn't be seeing it as a binary thing of humans or AI. We should be seeing it as humans and AI working together. And the circumstances and the context of what you're saying determines which is the best solution. And in most cases, it will be a combination of the two. So the sort of term that's being used a lot these days is agentic AI. And that's really what, I think people can misinterpret that as meaning that it's AI replacing human agents. It's not. It's humans working with the assistance of AI to deliver those experiences. So, so to your point, one of the examples is that in those circumstances, that example I just talked you through, in those circumstances where there is a context which enables fraudulent behavior, or where fraudulent behavior there's an increased risk of fraudulent behavior, then in that circumstance, absolutely AI should not be leading the interaction, or at least it shouldn't be the visible part of the interaction for customers. Whereas there are other circumstances. So, some great studies around this recently, which have shown that, when we're in a very time pressured or stressful situation, the priority for the customer, let's say you want to you booked a hotel and then you have to make a last minute rebooking because of, your plane is late or you've missed a connection or something like that. In those kind of time pressured situations, AI delivers a better experience for people because generally it's quicker and more efficient to use those tools for rebooking. And we don't want empathy. We don't want, we're not looking for creativity in problem solving at that circumstance, which are the capabilities that are still better delivered by humans versus AI. So in those circumstances, and again, where I would argue potentially the risks are much smaller, AI is a better tool for solving those problems. And I think one of the things that we've found as well, and our CEO, Chris Caldwell, talks a lot about this, is that, there's been a lot of coverage recently about some of the AI programs that haven't potentially delivered what businesses were expecting, to your point. And, a lot of the driver of that is not necessarily about the efficiency gains from it or any operational issues of integrating those tools. It's down to actually recognizing that it can't do everything, and that the solution is better to be a combination of human and AI rather than just a straightforward replacement of human roles. So, that's, I think, does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Totally. No, I think, and what you're highlighting here is, I think that it used to be just a sort of tech decision, right? How do we roll this stuff out, right? And the general move was, well, if we can give it to a machine, then we should give it to machines. Was the sort of trend, right? And hence you get self-service checkouts. What we're starting to realize, and what you're highlighting in what you're saying, is that actually it's not as simple as it looks. And that, back to your earlier point about behavioral science, because there's humans in the mix here.
Yes.
And so we have to recognize that actually this is a bit more complicated. And that's where the behavioral science skill set comes in, to say, here is a decision that you could logically make with an accountant's mindset or a procurement mindset or an IT mindset. But actually what you need to be thinking about is, what is that then going to do to the humans that are involved in whatever process this is brought into? So whether that's shoppers or whether that's someone phoning up a service center or just even employees engaging in some process, this technology can and often does impact the way that we behave, and not necessarily in predictable ways or not necessarily desirable ways, put it that way.
Well, both. Yeah, I think absolutely. One of my favorite quotes that I use quite a lot is a Daniel Kahneman one, as always, which is, which I saw him use at a conference back in 2016, I think it was. And he says that the difference between a human and an algorithm is that if you ask the same question of an algorithm, you'll get 100 times, you'll get the same answer 100 times. This is not true of humans. And, that unpredictability, that variability in our responses, in how we behave. And if you read the book Noise that he co-wrote with Cass Sunstein and
Olivier Sibony.
That's right. Yes. Sorry, I forgot his name for a moment. Yeah, they obviously is all about that variability in decision making. And you can have experts, insurance underwriters, for example, who've got the same background, experience, and so on, and yet there will be variability in the risk assessments and quotes that they provide, despite that, and high variability in it. That goes to that point, I think, in terms of, in simple terms, in the behavioral science frameworks that we use, algorithms are system 2 based because they're rules, and all algorithms are a set of rules. Whereas, as we know, humans consistently behave in system 1 type ways, where we are prone to biases, we are somewhat inconsistent, we are emotional in decision making, etc., etc. So yeah, absolutely, to your point. And I think, there's some really interesting examples around this in some of the latest research. So, I talked about that scenario of where speed is important, and therefore in that scenario, an AI-based tool might be more effective than a human. We also, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of evidence that in simple challenges and problems, AI-based tools can be more effective than humans. When we're talking about complex, nuanced problems, particularly those which require us to feel and show empathy, those are better served by humans generally. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't use empathy in AI, and this is something that I've written about recently, and we've published some research around this, and I come on to talk about this, but it does mean that, where empathy is the most critical and most important factor in an interaction. Let's say you need to contact your bank because a loved one has passed away and you're needing to sort out their bank account, their direct debits, their financial affairs. That's a very sensitive and high risk scenario for the bank and for the customer as well. And interacting with a bot is not going to be to give them the necessary empathy, understanding, and patience that is required in that scenario, for example. So there's interesting, that's one example of where, that difference in experience between interacting with AI and interacting with a human is really stark. Another one, which I think is a really interesting use case, is about when you're basically giving bad or good news. And particularly, for example, things like handling a rejection or giving an unfavorable offer. There's some evidence that suggests actually that if you're saying, let's say someone's made a loan application and it's being rejected, there's evidence that suggests that's better coming from a bot than it is coming from a human. Because when we tend to get good news, when we get favorable decisions, so let's say you're accepted for a loan application, we tend to put that down to our own merits. We tend to think it's because we're great. But when we get bad news or a negative outcome, we tend to think it's due to external factors. So, for example, I was never going to get the application approved anyway. They're biased against me because of X, Y, Z. And so because we think good decisions are down to our own individual merits, we think other humans are more likely to recognize that. And this is, again, an example of one of the biases that we have about that determine the nature of interaction between humans and between bots. And I think that's really interesting because if you think about it in that context, again, let's say you're a bank and you're having to give out these decisions to people, making it clear and transparent about how those decisions are made is often a regulatory compliance requirement for good reason. But how you then communicate the decision and where that decision comes from, and therefore how your customers respond to it, is something that I don't think is given enough thought, and where behavioural science can really add.
Which is fascinating, right? Because I guess conventional logic would be, oh, okay, well, what we'll do is we either have the machine communicate the decision or we don't. Right. So we'll just give the decision maker communication to the machine. You're saying it's really so there's a whole load of extra layers. So if you don't understand the nuance here, you could draw the wrong conclusion, right? Because what you're in effect saying is, let's assume it's a binary decision. I can't imagine what a non-binary decision in a loan would be, but I guess you could borrow less money or maybe more or something. But if it was sort of like yes, no decision, that wouldn't immediately be obvious because you would sort of go, well, either we'll get the machine to communicate or we won't. And then the bit that layering on top of that is, I love the fact that, there's the TV show Little Britain where there's a funny sketch about computer says no.
Yes.
Right?
And
and so the sort of common parlance is that's annoying and irritating when a machine makes a decision, partly because in the comedy sketches communicated by a particularly irritating person.
Yes, exactly.
But nonetheless,
the key point is humans saying it.
Yeah. But that, that sort of points us in this direction. But I love the fact that what you've pulled out there is a really nuanced point. So if you really want to understand this, and back to the why do you need behavioral science in this space, is that lots of these things are counterintuitive, they're nuanced. And if you don't understand those things, you can get this badly wrong. And because of the impact that the machines have on humans, you can get it really badly wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think another interesting example of that is when we talk about sensitive information. So, again, in a financial setting, you're often asking for personal information and potentially high risk information or risk that could be used for fraud. But also in a medical setting, for example, you obviously are having to ask sensitive information about people's medical history and so on, thinking about medical insurance providers and so on. And what's interesting again is that because we perceive bots and AI as neutral and non-judgmental, when privacy and objectivity are important, then actually sometimes we'll get better and more accurate information by using an AI in that scenario. So there was a study that showed that when sensitive information was required, again in a medical setting, that people disclosed over 11% more into that information to an AI agent than they did to a human doctor. And that's really interesting as well, because if you think about it, they're not just disclosing medical information to some random person, they're disclosing it to a medical professional, someone who, whose job it is to gather this information and act on it. But they were more comfortable doing that to an AI agent than they were to a doctor, simply because there was a degree of embarrassment about the information or sensitivity to it. And you talked earlier about the McDonald's embarrassment factor as well. That's, I think, aligns with what you were saying there, that, using the touch screens, you're not having to say that to another person, and therefore there's no element of disclosure to worry about. So I think, that's a really interesting scenario as well. We would think, of course, you're going to be more comfortable talking to a medical professional because they are the people who deal with this every day. They are people who are qualified to deal with it. But actually, sometimes in those scenarios, use of an AI-based tool or making it clear that this information is neutral, not judgmental, there's no humans who are going to have sight of this, might lead to better outcomes.
And you mentioned when we met up this idea that if we look at, say, call centers as a good example, when it comes to sort of sensitive topics, there are certain things, and you've highlighted this before, that are off limits for machines. So bereavement would be a good illustration where you don't want to have somebody have it. So we pass that to the human beings. And the point that you made to me, which I thought was really interesting and has been preying on my mind in a really good way, is this idea that actually in this world where the technology takes over some of the things that it can take over, because that makes economic sense and it's good for efficiency, to have, say, a call center bot or a chat bot taking over the sort of simple stuff that it can do. The point you made to me, which I thought was really interesting, was that then that leaves humans to deal with the really sensitive stuff, the stuff you don't want to give to a machine. And that makes sense from the customer's perspective. But if you flip that round, what does that mean for the call center? Well, it means that their staff are constantly handling sensitive issues and don't have those basic cases to deal with anymore. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And I guess to some extent, I mean, gratifying is the wrong word, because I think it's quite it's a troubling consequence, and one that businesses, need to really to think about. But it was something I hypothesized in when I wrote my book, was that, as we were seeing more and more of these low risk, more transactional interactions with customers becoming automated and using these tools, the skill set that will require people, for example, in a call center, and also the nature of the work that will require people in call center environments will change. And to your point that, you're going to be dealing with the hard cases, the more sensitive cases, the ones that require the empathy, that require the sensitivity, and that are inherently more psychologically demanding, are going to become the bulk of the work for the humans in those environments. And we are starting to see that borne out over the last few years. And we've been working on a project recently for a client around, helping them with improving their resolution rates for customer contacts and complaints, and providing a better, improving their customer satisfaction scores and the quality of the experience they're providing to customers through a call center. And that's exactly what they've been experiencing and what the client reported to us. They said, look, we're making use of these AI tools, and they've been able to handle the easy, simple inquiries, but the more complex, the more nuanced, the more psychologically demanding circumstances. For example, when people are calling in states of distress, when people are angry or frustrated, when people need, and this particular client provides a support service for their customers, when people need that support urgently, and for example, if they may be vulnerable or they may have family members who are in a vulnerable situation, be it elderly or be it children, for example, they're having to handle more, your daily job working in those environments. You might have shifted from 20% of those calls on a daily basis being those kind of stressful, psychologically demanding kind of calls, to 70-80% of your calls being of that type. And, there's lots of implications of that. One of them is the nature of the job is that it becomes more stressful, more demanding. And that has obviously impacts for employee well-being and how we support and motivate and ensure that the staff have the resources they need to enable them to do the job effectively. It also means how you recruit and assess people in those jobs becomes more demanding. Kind of what used to be called kind of soft skills around those ability to be empathetic, to be actively listen, to mirror to some extent the behaviors and language that customers use in order to, which we know delivers a better experience. Those become more critical. So you need to recruit people and assess people based on those capabilities rather than what traditionally might be being used in contact centers for recruitment and the metrics of that, which might be kind of general intelligence tests and language competency and things like that. So those are still important, but you need to add another layer onto it in terms of those softer skills as well. And then the other aspect of it as well is that, understandably, if the job becomes more about those kind of stressful, psychologically demanding, empathy-based scenarios, then I always think of there's a great quote. I don't know where it came from, but what they say about people who work in the emergency services, for example, is that your interactions with your service users, with people who need the emergency services, is that you're dealing with people on the worst day of their lives consistently, and that is hugely psychologically demanding. Now, in most customer service scenarios, it's not going to be the worst day of their lives, but certainly you're going to be dealing with more people who are having a bad day. And that is, and we know that people will sometimes lash out, people will be abusive and so on in those contexts. I'm not saying the levels of abuse are increasing in those environments, and we have to manage those scenarios, and the training and support that we provide for our teams helps them minimize that as much as they possibly can. But what it means is that the workload of people in those environments is getting more emotionally demanding and more psychologically demanding. And as you can imagine, that has impacts on all of those areas I mentioned, but also it will impact on attrition rates, on self-reported motivation and well-being, and all of the things, that we know can impact on productivity as well. So I think that's a really interesting challenge, and one that, lots of businesses are trying to address, including ourselves. And, that is a potential side effect of use of these technologies that's not being considered. And again, it goes back to this point about, it's not a like for like replacement in terms of you can't get an AI bot to do everything that a human does or vice versa. It should be the way that we should be thinking about these problems is the combination of the two, and the technology supporting the humans in your business rather than directly replacing them.
Super interesting. Thank you. This points to, I guess, a similar logic that one would deploy with tech normally. So, soft rollout, don't just suddenly switch over. Now, normally that's done to make sure the technology does what it is supposed to do. But actually, what you're pointing towards here is to say it's worth doing a sort of small rollout of things to see what happens to the humans. Because some of these things, a lot of the things you were talking about, it makes sense, but it's almost it makes sense with hindsight when we've got the experience, because often we don't. Some of it's kind of predictable. If you follow the flow of what you've just said, you would sort of go, well, of course that makes sense, right? But that's a with hindsight based on experience. And so it sort of seems to me that there's a really strong argument here that staged rollouts, experimentation, all those sorts of things needs to be done as much for the humans in the loop as for the machines.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, it won't surprise you to learn that I very much would support that approach and endorse it, because, my book has test tubes on the front. The kind of central hypothesis of it, if you want to call it that, was about what I call test tube behaviors, which is a combination of applying what we know from behavioral science and this understanding of human behavior and the evidence base from that, but also very much adopting that kind of test and learn approach, because that is how science works, and that's how we should be using decision-making in business to get the best outcomes. So absolutely, that kind of managed rollout and approach and understanding of, because every context is different and behavior is very contextual, is the way to go in my view. And, again, the beauty of that kind of approach where you're keeping the human in the loop, using the technology to assist them rather than directly replace them, makes that easier as well. You can go, right, here's the tool, here's the platform, start using it, and gradually increase the number of use cases that you use it for, based on this understanding and having tested it and finding it works and working out where it's appropriate and where it isn't appropriate. And as I say, we've got a great body of evidence that's growing every day now around what kind of interactions it's best for and what kind of interactions it's not appropriate for. But that will change for the individual use cases and the individual clients that we're working. So as I say, this client we've been working with recently, they've discovered that there's actually a lot of interactions where speed is of the essence. They will need help and they need it right now. And in that circumstance, if there aren't additional complexities to the interaction around vulnerabilities or a niche case for their needs, and the AI-based tool that they have in place works really, really well, and people really appreciate and value because it gets you the help you need as quickly as it possibly can, and much quicker than a human could provide it. But in those other circumstances, when there's a human can only deal with that, and they need that empathy around it. And I think, as I touched on earlier, that's not to say that we can't provide empathy through AI-based tools as well. So again, one of the things that's borne out by some of the recent research is that, there are different types of empathy. And I guess if it's of interest, I can sort of outline a bit.
Yeah, please do. It's fascinating.
A bit about it. So there's, broadly speaking, 3 different types of empathy that we can provide. And this applies whether you're interacting with a human or non-human. There's kind of attentive empathy, which is basically what's often known as active listening. I've listened to what you said, play back what you've heard. So, in a customer service context, that could be, let me confirm, since the update, you've been able to access your account. Okay. Now, it's just basically all you've done is summarize whatever the issue is for a customer in that context. The second type of empathy is what's called effective empathy, which is where you not only acknowledge that concern, but you also acknowledge the emotions that someone's feeling in a particular circumstance and validate their situation. So you basically say, oh, I can see how frustrating that must be for you. Let me try and fix it for you. Yeah, something like that. And then the third type of empathy is what's called cognitive empathy. And most of the studies around this show that this is the most effective form of empathy in terms of both increasing the satisfaction of the recipient or customer in getting this, but also just generally it leads to better outcomes. So this is cognitive empathy. And what that means is you've taken the other person's perspective, but you've also offered a solution. So you've gone, I can understand why you're frustrated, your shipment is late, but here's what I'm going to do to fix it now for you. So if you think about this in a social context, when a friend's telling us about a problem they're experiencing, I can understand the different types of empathy and when sometimes you want those different types of empathy. So sometimes you just want someone to listen and to acknowledge they've listened. Sometimes you want someone to listen and to say, I feel really bad for you, that's terrible. And sometimes you want a situation where someone's listened and gone, that's really terrible. Okay, I'm going to do something to help you now. That you can understand those differences. And you can see why in a customer service context, the third one is the most useful to people. Now, the problem is you can design very easily responses from an AI-based tool to reflect all 3 of those types of different types of empathy, but attentive, effective, and cognitive. You could design for that. The problem is we know intrinsically as people that AI doesn't have emotions. We know it doesn't feel emotions. It doesn't have the same lived experiences and learned experiences that we have as people. So when you get an AI saying to you, oh, this is really frustrating, I understand how you feel, we know, no, it doesn't understand how I feel because it's a bot. It can't feel that. And we get what we call reactance in psychological terms. And that is when we push back on something because we feel that someone is trying to limit our choices or affect our choices. And we think it's fake, basically, because it is. And so we'll react to it then. So there's a really critical, so to your point about the kind of nuances of the interaction, there's a really critical point here, which is that we can design AI to be helpful and supportive, but it can't pretend to have human emotions because then that's insincere and that's something that people react to negatively. And it can actually make the interaction worse and make us more annoyed. Yeah, particularly if, to be honest, it doesn't provide the solution that we want. And, one of the things that we do a lot of work around in customer experiences is to recognize that there will be circumstances when you can't provide an immediate resolution. So, we did some work with a telecoms company recently on complaint handling and resolution. And one of the challenges with that is often it requires a technical solution. So your broadband has dropped out for some reason. You call them up to ask what's happening. and it might require an engineer to come around to fix it. And obviously that's not a solution that necessarily can happen immediately. It might be a few days, for example, before the engineer can come out and fix it. Now, what the telecom provider wants to do in that situation is it wants to reassure the customer that it will be resolved successfully, but also it needs to manage their expectations to say, we will fix it for you, but you're not going to get it fixed straight away. And what they want to avoid in that situation is obviously the customer then either leaving for a different provider or escalating the complaint, because escalations are bad for lots of reasons, but in particular in the telecoms industry, there are direct fines from the regulator for them for escalation. So what we were doing there was to provide the tools and techniques for advisors to be able to say, don't worry, this is all in hand. I'll get this fixed for you, to be empathetic to the complaint, but also to reassure the customer that it's going to be resolved so that they don't keep calling back and or they escalate the complaint. So, that's where empathy becomes really critical. And we were very successful in that context in that we were able to reduce the escalations by 5%, but we also increased the actual resolution rates for the complaints on the same day by 4%. So we did actually improve the rates of resolving the complaints as well. But there will be circumstances where you can't provide an immediate resolution and you need to reassure customers. And a bot saying, oh, I know exactly how you feel, I'd be really annoyed if my internet dropped out, is not going to work because they don't understand that, obviously. So you have to take that into account. That said, it is really important to do the attentive empathy bit to say, I've listened to and understood your issue, and therefore, so I'm working from correct information that will then allow me to either escalate or pass on this issue to someone who can help for you and to resolve it successfully. So you see the difference there. So it's not to say that you can't use empathy, and empathy isn't important in an interaction with a bot. It's just that the types of empathy and the way it's used is very, very different, and the context will decide what's most appropriate.
And again, it's fascinatingly nuanced, right? And to your point, and I was laughing as you were talking about the bot sort of pretending to be human, because I had something ChatGPT where, and I can't remember what it was, sort of to a travel recommend. I was just playing with it to see what it came up with, and it was just one throwaway comment about, oh yeah, I like going to X2, right, or some sort of thing that if you said it to me, I'd be cool with, right? So and it coloured my whole experience of the interaction, because it was almost like I was lulled out of my full sense of security, where I was kind of like having a nice conversation and sort of learning something, almost like I would do from a friend. And to your point, that was so, the visceral nature of the thing, I just went, oh my God, like, stop it, enough now. And I sort of snapped out, and it coloured the whole thing. And so I think this really points to, particularly when you are dealing with sensitive topics, the ability to sort of red mist to appear from anyone. It can happen very, very suddenly. And that's not an attribute that AI, I'm going to say for some time, is going to be able to handle, because you need to really be able to read the room, particularly when you're not with the person and not in the physical room. You've got to take whatever cues you can get. And that's really hard to codify. So I think that's fascinating. It also strikes me, Richard, as you're talking, one of the other dynamics that we see with AI, and I've seen it in the context of professional services firms or consultants. I'm never sure if they're included in professional services. Let's park that with the management consultancy end of the spectrum, where, there's a lot of talk about, we don't need to hire junior people anymore because we can just get AI to do that. And then you get that question of, well, who's going to be the senior people in 10 years' time if you don't have the junior people going through doing these things? And it occurs to me the same dynamic applies here, which is to handle those sensitive calls, the challenging ones, you sort of need some experience of doing the unchallenging ones. And if those have been taken away from you increasingly or completely, where do you get new people in this space? Because you're not really building a sustainable model for the humans in the organization to be able to learn, because we all make mistakes. You're kind of going to want people to make mistakes on low risk calls in a call center.
Yes.
You don't want them making a mistake on a highly sensitive one, particularly if you're talking about the industries where, as you pointed out, the complaints will get escalated. So this idea of where are the humans going to come to fulfill this role, and how is that sustainable? And I guess also, if the AI goes down for whatever reason, you need them to sort of step it. So there's a point there where the sort of going through the rituals of learning, which from an efficiency perspective makes no sense whatsoever, but from a sustainability perspective makes massive sense. Those sorts of things need to be thought about as well, I guess.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think, I guess to some extent, a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the work that my team does is based around, identifying the behavioral nudges or interventions that we can use to deliver those optimal experiences. And in a contact center environment, a lot of that comes down to the language and wording that you use when you're interacting with customers and creating guidance and scripting for that, and then training that into the teams. So I guess to some extent, we're equipping those teams, whether they're on day 1 or day 1,000, we're equipping them with better tools and techniques to be able to help with those interactions, to help them be, if it's required, more empathetic, or to better resolve customer problems and issues. So, you could argue, well, okay, that's not experience dependent as long as they're using these tools and techniques. But absolutely, there's still an element of that, which is based on your own learning, your own experiences. One of the things I talked about in my book, actually, 5 years ago, was that having, I've got a lot more experience working in call centers now, because that's a core part of our business at Concentrix. But, even then I'd worked trained probably 1,000 or so or more contact center people at that point. And one of the things you notice about really skilled call center staff is that within milliseconds of a call starting, they kind of have an indication of how the call's going to go, based on the tone of voice, based on the language, based on the, maybe not milliseconds, but certainly a few seconds of the start of the interaction. They can adjust their approach based on the nature of the customer and how the customer is feeling. And a lot of that is going to be subconscious. A lot of that is learned through experience. And a lot of it is intuitive. And so absolutely. You get that through that experience and through having had that experience of calls. And one of the things that we do notice is that when we provide training, I should say the scripting and guidance that we provide in call centers is not just a group of my team of experienced practitioners and behavioral scientists going in and saying, the science says this, so you should say this. It is, it's informed by research. We do call listening, we interview, we spend time with the people on the front line, so we benefit from their learned experience. And often what a lot of the interventions that we develop is based on is, this thing seems to work when I say it to customers, but I don't know why. And we're able to say, well, we think it works because this is what behavioral science would tell us as to why it's an effective form of words or phrasing that you're using. So let's standardize that so everyone does it. Because as often is the case, there are pockets of good practice, or there are different ways of approaching things that individual teams might be doing, or often call center operations are split across multiple sites, often in different countries. So they might be doing things slightly different in one country to another. And so, what we're doing is going, actually, what these guys are doing over here works really well. So you should all start doing it. And we standardize that. Do you see what I mean? So I think, you raise a really interesting point, which is, are we going to be missing out on some of that learned experience and benefit if we are throwing people a bit in the deep end, I guess is the analogy maybe, in terms of straight onto these kind of calls? And is there a risk inherent in that? Possibly, as I say, possibly there is. But I do feel that, because we are equipping them with the tools and the understanding that we help with that. But there is also this challenge, as I mentioned earlier, about, how we recruit and how we apply that in these environments, because there are great psychometric tools, assessment tools, for example, which can be used to identify those people who innately have the right skill set and the ability in terms of whether it's attentive empathy and active listening, or whether it's just, problem solving skills inherently that we can assess for and that we can test people for. And in fact, we can use AI to help as well. So that's one way of looking at the problem, is actually going, sure, some of that comes from experience, but also there are people who have innate skills around it. One example I used in my book actually was when I was working with a bank in the UK, and we were working in a contact center, and there was one contact center. So one of the challenges with this bank was that they had quite an old customer base. I remember when I was doing the call listening, I think the oldest customer I had call in was well into their 90s. And there was one person in the call center who was brilliant at dealing with these customers, because as you can imagine, a lot of the challenges were around, for example, ID and verification and security information. I might even have used this example when I was on your podcast the first time, so apologies if I'm repeating myself. But what was really interesting was that this person was brilliant at dealing with customers, and she was a very recent school leaver. So she didn't have a huge amount of experience. She was probably only 17, 18, but was fantastic at dealing with these elderly customers. and was endlessly patient and empathetic and wouldn't rush them through the process, which would get them more stressed and lead to worse outcomes. And I said, well, what's your secret? You really, the levels of patience you're displaying with these customers, it's phenomenal. And she said, I just imagine I'm talking to my grandmother. And, she had a very close relationship with the grandmother, really, really liked and respected the grandmother. And so when she was talking to customers, that was to be able to do this kind of, if you want to call it, this phrase like deep acting that's used in the context when empathy is required. To do that, she was just, visualizing that she was talking to her grandmother on the phone. And I was like, well, that's a really effective and simple technique that you can use in this circumstance. And to some extent gets around that experience issue. But it's a really interesting point that you raise. And I think it's something that we need to think about solutions for.
But what I love is you've kind of addressed it, I think, in two ways. One is by saying, rather than recognizing the nature of what people are going to be doing, is rather than saying, right, here's a list that you must slavishly follow. This is what you do. Here's the script to slavishly follow. Is you've kind of gone with a human experience led thing that says, actually, let's learn about not what should theoretically work, but what actually works. And let's see how those, and let's roll that out, right? So we're taking that. So in other words, it's not theory that's guiding it. It's lived experience. And the second thing, I guess, is what you're saying is we hire for those higher skills. And so the recruitment process, so you've got to, I guess, be much more laser targeted. So in a kind of conventional model, you could say, we'll hire lots of people and we'll see if they work out or not. And we'll put them on the lower risk stuff, right? And the ones that don't work out, we don't promote. And the ones that we do, we put on the difficult stuff. A classic sort of pyramid model. And I guess you're just saying, well, we don't have that bottom tier. So the way we compensate for that is we're hiring for those higher level skills. We're putting them in the position to be able to do that. They've got the aptitude and we're training them in a way that is effective to be able to do that, which I think is a really interesting response, because that points to, I guess, having to value human beings in a different way and the inputs that they can give. And so a much more human recruitment and training process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something I very passionately believe in and I think is borne out by the evidence base. And, I've been fortunate in that I've had a bit more understanding and knowledge and exposure to this because, one, the nature of the work that we do at Concentrix, but also I've built some friendships and connections in the business psychology world. I used to be on the board of the Association for Business Psychology in the UK. And those are the kind of challenges that those practitioners are facing on a daily basis. And really, what they're passionately advocating is exactly that, is to have these understanding of these uniquely human traits, and the way we recruit and assess and manage people needs to be reflective of the fact that each job is different, each job is unique, and there are particular skill sets that are required for each one. And there's not really a one size fits all approach to that. And there are, a number of great validated tools available there to do that. And I think the other reason why that's really important, and again, this was something I wrote about in my book, is that, that's the only effective way to de-bias a process. We should be hiring people based on their ability to do the job, rather than, who their mates are, where they went to school, color of their skin, gender, those things. I mean, the fact that we still have to say that in 2025 is a crazy thing, but that is what we should be hiring people for, because it's not just because it's fair and it's the way that the society should work, but because that's the best way. The only way you get the best people for the job is you hire them based on their ability to do the job effectively and their suitability for that. And part of that is experience, as we've touched on as well. But part of that is certain innate traits that are results of our upbringing, genetics, whatever it might be. But they are still things that make us more suitable or less suitable for a job. And that's a really key part of it. So yeah, I do think that's something that we don't consider enough. And what I said in my book, which I think is being borne out by recent experience and by the way the world and the industry is going, is that we need to be thinking of the psychological foundations, if you want to call it that, of jobs are becoming more and more important. And that just amplifies the roles of behavioral science and psychology and business psychology in general, is that, when the routine automated tasks that form part of our daily roles and daily jobs become delivered by AI, and we're become reliant on AI-based tools to deliver those, the bits that will keep us in work all of us are the bits that only humans can do. And those are the bits that have the strongest psychological foundation in terms of that need for empathy, that need for creativity, those elements of it. I was looking back at some of the data I shared in my book, which obviously again was a few years ago. And the ONS predicted in, I think it was 2018, the jobs that there was 1.5 million jobs they said were at risk of being automated due to the advance of AI. And bear in mind, this was 7 years ago in the UK. And the ones that were most at risk were waiters. So that was the number one job that was most at risk of being automated. Now, I don't have the data to say whether there are fewer waiters now working in the UK than there were in 2018. But I think going back to your McDonald's example, effective McDonald's obviously never really had table service, but you could see in that scenario, if every restaurant went to the McDonald's model of using the touchscreens and self-service model, then of course the waiting industry would disappear overnight. But that hasn't happened. And part of the reason that hasn't happened is because we don't just go for the restaurants based on the speed of delivery of the food. And, there is a whole host of other reasons that we go to a restaurant. And you're not going to go to the Fat Duck and expect to order on a touchscreen.
If he did it, I reckon he'd do it in a really cool way, right?
Yeah, maybe. Actually, maybe, yeah. It would be quite innovative. It would be quite a Heston Blumenthal solution. But you get what I mean.
Yeah.
The experience is not about that. And so, these non-conscious and more intangible elements of what make a great customer experience also determine the skill set that we need and what jobs we need to fill. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I've kind of gone on a little bit of a tangent.
No, it's perfect. Super helpful. And I think, what I love about the way you talk about it is that there's a realism and a recognition of the realities, right? Which I'd expect nothing less from someone that works in this space. But there's a really positive thing here. And it's not sort of blind optimism in the future, but what you're pointing towards is a real understanding of, what humans are good at, what they can do, and where they can make the difference. And therefore, what we ought to be focusing on and designing systems and processes to allow that to occur. And so I think it's a really wonderful illustration of actually behavioral science and you're painting a really positive picture of there's no point in having people doing things that machines can do better, but there is absolutely point in having people doing things people can do best. And so how do we get that? And I think what interests me about your work is it's not just diagnosing what's happening, it's how do we then design a world that allows that to happen? And that is a very human-centric design. And so I'm not, yes, there is always a risk of the AI apocalypse and everything else, but there is a real positive vibe to what you're saying, which is if we get this right, we can start to create jobs for people that are meaningful, that suits them well. And so we can deal with a lot of other challenges of people not having work that fulfills them, because actually what you're talking about doing is creating really, really important roles that only humans can fulfill and making sure that we have the best possible people in them and that they are equipped to be able to do it.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think, maybe I have a hopelessly optimistic and utopian view of the future. But I guess what I talked about in my book, which 5 years on, are we any closer to that world? I don't know. But what I talked about was there is a potential here for a world in which, to your point, the things that we don't like to do as humans, things that we find annoying, repetitive, boring, we will design for those and create tools that help us to do those things. And, in a work context, those are the boring, repetitive, productivity restricting elements of our roles. AI should be helping us with those. And, there are people sharing examples every day of how they've used, for example, LLMs to help us with those parts of their job. But that frees us to do bits of the job that we find rewarding, and the roles become the ones that we find rewarding and that more motivating and that are more human-centered. There's that great quote. I always forget the name of the person who came up with it, who said, I want AI to do the dishes and laundry for me so I can focus my time on writing and art. Not the other way around,
Right.
Which is, I don't want AI to be creating art and writing, so I have more time to do dishes and laundry. And that's the essence of it, I think, in a work context, is that you want, we would, in our daily jobs, we would like the AI tools not to be directly replacing our skills, but it would be to enhance our skills and to work with us to do the aspects of the roles that we don't find as motivating and rewarding. And I think the flip side of what we talked about, for example, in a call center context, whereby you're spending more time on those difficult, complex, nuanced, and potentially more emotionally demanding calls, in that example, is those are also the calls that when you get a good resolution from them and a good outcome from them, we find more rewarding. People find more rewarding. You've helped someone in need and you've resolved their query and they're happy. They're a happy customer as a result. Those are the calls that people come off them and go, that was great. That's why I'm here. And that's the thing that motivates me and is more rewarding. The bog standard, repetitive, easy queries, sure, it's potentially easy work, but it's also not going to be as motivating a reward for those people. So does that make sense? So I think, that's, as I say, maybe I'm a hopeless optimist in that way, but I do feel that's the potential and the opportunity that the technologies give us. And we are, as I say, in our work at Concentrix, we are starting to see that. And, with the tools that we're developing using AI and providing that support systems and enabling our teams to do their jobs better and enable their clients to serve their customers better, that's the positive benefit from it, aside from the productivity gains and the efficiency gains and the improvements in metrics like customer satisfaction.
Love it. Richard, I think that is the perfect uplifting note on which to end things. Before I let you go, I will, of course, put a link in the show notes to your previous appearance on the show. Remind people what your book is called, because you said it's 5 years old. I'll take your word for it, because I can't believe it's been that long. But it's still a cracking read, because I had another little look at it before we jumped on the call. So still comes highly recommended. So tell people about that and how they can get hold of you if they want to find out more and get your help.
Thank you. Yeah. So the book's called The Behavior Business, published by Harriman House, available on Amazon and, other retailers of your choice. And also, as I say, I'm Director of Behavioural Science at Concentrix. People can contact me through there or through LinkedIn. I'm not very active on other social media channels for a whole host of other reasons these days. But yeah, please do feel free to reach out there and connect. And love to hear people's thoughts and feedback based on that. As I say, the book is 5 years old. So the sections on AI in particular, the use cases, have moved on quite a lot since then. But I've been reviewing it recently. There's a few things available via the Concentrix website where I've built on and written about the newer use cases and evidence base around it. And I think the conclusions that I drew in that book, as I say, and the hypotheses still hold true, which is gratifying. But then, as I always like to say, the technology moves fast. Human evolution doesn't. Our brains are still fundamentally the same as they were 5 years ago and 5,000 years ago. So truisms of behavioral science are still applicable.
Love it. And of course, thank you so much for once again being a fabulous guest on the show.
Thanks very much.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course to Richard for appearing. To find out more about Richard, his work, his book, The Behavior Business, and to hear the previous episode of the show in which he appeared, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining us. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. It allows other people to find the show, and that in turn allows me to attract high-quality guests like Richard. If you haven't been listening for that long, you might also be interested in visiting the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. There you will find almost 350 episodes, and there's bound to be something to tickle your fancy. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. If you're bringing technology into your life, have a think about the impact it might be having on you. It's not necessarily all positive. Stay safe. But above all, thank you so much for listening.